everyone. How's lunch? Okay, so we have our next speaker, Kat Kent. So in her role as a digital literacy program manager at Deakin University, Kate explored innovative digital teaching and learning initiatives. The learning in how technologies, people, and learning wave together has led to the production of an open educational resource interactive textbook, which we will hear about today. So please welcome Kat.
Thank you. Oh, you found the energy at the end of the day to do that clap, so I appreciate that. And even these tired old eyes can see most of your faces. And so if I trip you out by looking at you too much, it's just because I might have had a vague moment. And it's not you, it's definitely me. So as my lovely chair indicated, my name is Kat Cain. I work for Deakin University in the library space. And I'm really focused on learning experience and partnerships kind of capacity. So both of those things are a really beautiful match to open education, open access and inclusive education goals, and they're very close to my heart. So today I'm going to share with you a collaborative open education project that began in 2021, grew over 2022, and will wrap up this year. It will. So, as it's already been talked about, it's an open education resource project, and it's sought to really lean authentically into equity, into open access, and we relied really heavily on digital affordances in both the creation, the design choices, and ultimately for its intended use. But before I really get into it, I have a confession, is that I can sometimes slip into academic jargon. I can go all ed tech speak or just theories. In fact, when I first submitted my abstract, it got, what the heck does that mean? And I had to resubmit it. And there was a reason for that, because I had things like this, and things like this. So while I'm going to try really hard not to slip into that kind of ed speak, sometimes it's going to happen because this literally comes out of an education space and it's designed for education students and practitioners. So let's talk about the philosophies, the frameworks and the pedagogy, because it is unavoidable to talk about them because it was so impactful in what we did. Please interrupt me if I do start to go on a neoliberal rant or start to talk about hermeneutics, because nobody needs to hear that today. But what I'll try and do is put things in more concrete terms, like, that was my second abstract attack. This is what we did. An online but downloadable interactive textbook that offers a grounding in play-based learning and shares authentic assessment potentials in play. This was a really media-rich resource, and it was designed to guide educators in their play-based teaching journey by linking theory to practice. So the textbook was really focused on providing accessible, easy to use, and interesting experiences that shared these knowledges. And it was designed to be an object, an artefact at the end, the deliverable, that could be easily read, but also reflectively used. And we wanted to engage both teachers, teacher educators, to be embedded in university and TAFE courses. But more than that, we really wanted it to be a resource that went out into the world, into the open spaces, so it could be used by the practitioners already out there. Those educators that we all know that have been doing it tough for the last few years, doing the hard yards. And we wanted a guide that they could engage and use moving forward. So, no publisher paywalls, which is a big thing, no university access barriers. We wanted to go open by design from the get-go. This is a typical thing that this story will share and that I would share in a presentation. It always comes back to the people and about the place. So, we want to meaningfully acknowledge the grounding of the work in the who and the where. Because this project is heavily shaped by this people in technologies philosophy, we really do put people at the heart of our goal and the heart of our creation. So this framing consciously privileges people before the actual outfit, the artefact, the item. And so, with that framing, it's really important that I share the people in this story, in this community, the people who were both the people we wanted to build for and the people who did all of the work. So as I've already indicated who the people, the community we were aiming to connect with was, but the editorial team was a bunch of professors and notably visual designer and a multimedia sound specialist, as well as myself as a learning designer. It also had a lot of researchers and academic content. They're the authors. They're the ones who come up with the research, they'll rewrite it. But the other thing that we want to make really clear is that the actual execution of the book wouldn't have happened without people like our developer. And it also wouldn't have happened without guidance from an OER expert at Deakin. So we really do say thank you to the networks and industry bodies, our divisional areas, many Deakin colleagues for soundboarding and support, and for the Council of Australian Libraries for providing a space in which to publish. Now, we've already sort of flagged these are the three key things that we're talking about. Know your people, know who you're designing for, and know who you need at the table to design and create your people-focused outcome. And these three things really did continually shape the work that we did. And this, whether it's a open framework, putting together an open source legislation, building open data repositories, or creating an OER like this particular project, we all need these domain experts to come in, their varied knowledges. And it's also about being super clear about what you're building and who you're building the thing for. So, I've put the position of people front and centre. But the other thing I flagged was place. The Australian element has actually been a key part of the content development in this project. It brings Australian research in a particular area, play-based learning, to the fore. But we would note that the core concepts and practical implementation things have global possibilities. And I think all of us in this room can agree that place impacts creation, whether it's an artwork, whether it's code, or whether it's a book like this project. And I join you here in Naarm today, but this book grew and took place at Deakin, which sits at the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Geelong region, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of Greater Melbourne, and the Gunditjmara Mara people of the Warrnambool region. So workshops, meetings, conversation, design hours upon design hours, inspiration points, reflective work, testing, that was all grounded in space across these traditional lands. And this project has links across Australia, and its impact hopefully extends beyond those borders. So with that in mind, I do want to take a moment to reflect that context. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which Deakin students and teachers come together. As we learn and teach through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, as the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you may be learning and teaching, where education has taken place for many thousands of years. We also recognise place in our actual OER, in both the content and the context. Education has a long and rich history on this Australian continent, and we hope that we've honoured and reflected the ways that the Indigenous peoples have shaped our learning and knowledge bases in this country. So, we also recognise the profound impact global Indigenous voices have had in education, learning, and human ontologies. Now, I know I said ontologies, but let's move past it. So, let's dive in. Creating open educational resources is really an emergent space for Deakin at the moment. We are just piloting and experimenting. There's all sorts of new possibilities. Doing more than just making a PDF is what we're aiming to do. Now, we arrived at this particular OER, like all good journeys, through a series of twists and turns. There were a number of catalysts for creation and a number of supporting elements, but it began with two previous projects. One was an education course that had to be digitally transformed, both for COVID reasons, but also because the particular course model had changed. We also had another project that was about digital professional learning that we did with the Department of Education and Training. So with the course transformation project, we really had to transform learning materials that started in that physically located experience and redesigned them for a digital classroom and learning experience. And the core learning from that particular project was how diverse the people were at the heart of the project, both the students as the intended recipients of the learning, or the engaging in the learning, and the staff who built it. The other thing that should be noted from this particular project is that the cohort was incredibly diverse and involved people as far away as the Tiwi Islands through to Tasmania. And they also, some of them came through the pathway of Naikiri, which is an Indigenous institute at Deakin. So the other major project that informed this one we're talking about today was a digital learning program, as I said. Now, this was like a really big tender kind of contract type of project with the Department of Education and Training. And in fact, that's why some IP and copyright things have become a bit complex, which is why I have not published this week, but it's coming. It's because this was a free online learning program. It was multifaceted. It had all sorts of webinars, modules, and an online community of practice. But the important thing for our project today is that we took research from that program and we took learnings, and it gave us reportable insights from the users because we did a lot of surveying and user testing. And so all of that came together to have a kind of a pedagogical narrative. And all these theories about digital learning, transitioning to university, digital communities, all informed the work that we did. So principles, frameworks and practices did emerge from those projects, and that shaped the design and development of this interactive textbook. So here's where I get a bit educational. We had a really important framework in 3 parts. One was a people and technologies philosophy. The second was the importance of pedagogies for digital experiences. And the third one was evaluation, which I won't be talking about today. So here's my philosophy, framework, pedagogy that came out of previous projects. It privileges people and relationships, as you can see, because we believe there's reciprocal relationships in people technologies, and that it's essential to privilege the learner or the user. Now, this is obviously a very education-focused lens that I'm showing you. You know, we've got online learners as a core area. We've got curriculum or course enhancement staff. But our contention is that this can actually be adapted for any work with technology, because you can spot those alignments with human-centred design and user experience. Now, the other bit that was sort of underpinning the work that we did on this book was a concept called ICI. And it shapes the way that you design the learning material to be immediate, collaborative, and interactive. And it's all about weaving points of engagement in a scaffolded way, in a way that builds from known supports to new areas of learning, and it also relies very heavily on feedback and mechanisms. But I'm not speaking to a whole big education group, so I don't want to go on about, you know, pedagogies and grounding and stuff like that all day. This is probably the more interesting stuff for this group. Well, how did we design, develop, and build it? We had a couple of main tools that we worked. The boring old reliable Word. Now, Microsoft 365 version. So that was for content development and just general communication and design elements. The reason we went for that is because it was accessible and really familiar to our academic contributors. When we tried to use other tools in this space, it did not work. And even sometimes the online part of Microsoft Word became complicated with different people having versions on their desktop and all those kind of challenges. We also used a team site really heavily for communication, information architecture, keeping the very complex documents between design briefs and research articles, all of that kind of stuff. And we relied heavily on Zoom or team video call because this was during a time of a pandemic, so we couldn't get together as much as we would like to actually workshop in person. The kind of tools that were used in the book were video recording and editing tech, same stuff for sound, Adobe Suite, H5P, which is a HTML5 content, and all of that kind of stuff actually went into the book. And the book itself sits in a platform called Pressbooks, which many of you will be aware of. Now, in a perfect world, the key project member, our visual designer, Sarah Fennelly, would be here, and she could walk you through the visual design steps and how to use Figma. But sometimes the non-domain expert has to rock up and try and do their best. So with that in mind, these are the 4 stages that the visual design of our OER went through. Pretty obviously, scope, stage style guide, prototype, and build. You know, scoping is something very standard. Everybody does this kind of work. Enviro scanning, figuring out what our Pressbooks and other tools could do, what was the training needed for our staff to build and use them. All of that sort of defining and investigating kind of work, the typical investigation stuff. Stage 2 was the style guide, and that's been built into Figma, as has the prototype, and I'm going to go live to that in a moment. And lastly was stage 4, the build, which is a Pressbooks instance, and again, I'll go live. All right, fingers crossed. See how this tool goes. All right. Has anyone in this room worked with Figma before? Oh, nice. So this is just an invaluable tool because it visualises design concepts in a way that non-visual people, non-visual designers can really understand. So this was our visual designer put together a vision board, the inspiration points, and this was able to be shown and walked through with the authors and the editors. And it made the concepts that had been just in text really visible to the editorial and the authorial community. So in brief, the visual designer had outlaid the inspiration for the colour palettes, which was taking inspiration from Australia Flora, that primary school experience that many of us have had. There was a definite leaning towards muted colour, and that was for cognitive load reasons, for the text-heavy content to just have a softening. There was also choices around typography and Pressbook themes. And we went for standard stuff that comes in Pressbooks. And the reason for that was to make it sustainable so we didn't have to get too much dev work. And the illustrations and the iconography, as I show you the actual book, you'll see that the lines don't meet up in some parts. And that was to reflect how kids draw, because they never quite finish a line. It's all very fluid and organic. The style guide then stepped into a prototype stage. And I might just go to chapter 1. And so again, it's a really crucial step in the process because, as I said, the visual designer could show the authors and editorial team what the content would eventually look like in the actual book. And so this is an open practice to be transparent in the decision points. There's ways to communicate and comment on the work, and to make sure that the design was going in the track that the original authors intended. The other interesting thing about this tool is it just does wonderful stuff to be able to check accessibility between desktop, tablet, and all that kind of stuff. The other thing that this tool allowed us to do by prototyping was to see as learning designers where the content had gone too long, where it had put too much load on the learner to move through, and where we might need to break it up or edit so that their digital experience and learning experience flowed much better. So now, while I can't give you a link to our published, very nearly published book, I'm going to open it up from my editor view and walk you through this. Now, the other thing I'd note is as we go through, there is some accessible functions that have been put in that our developer worked on. And if you are working on a Pressbook project and want some of that coding, our developer is very happy to share that with the community. So, this is what Pressbooks looks like. And this was a very important element, was that you can choose to download this book in different formats. Now, this is because some of our intended learners do live in remote and regional areas. And we're talking very remote. We're talking only have access to the internet in sporadic times, sometimes when they come for the community-based learning at Deakin. So they needed ways to be able to download and experience the content even when they weren't connected to the net. Although the book is an interactive book and there are elements that require being online to access, we've made sure to have accessible content either below or in an accessible appendix so that they don't lose that information. And that's been very important. So let's jump in. Don't need to show you the contributors. This is very important too around opening the learning to people, is being very clear about how to engage with this kind of learning, to prep the learners into the reflective learning model that it uses, to let them know they need to have some sort of way to keep a digital record or a paper record, that there'll be listening and viewing and speaking modes that are part of this guide, this book. And we guide them really clearly and signpost throughout. So I'm going to show you, have a look. It's a very pared back, clean design for a reason, because it is a textbook. It's not here to create an immense visual experience. It's about a different way of engaging with learning, but largely text-based. However, we did rely heavily on podcasts, or vodcasts in this case, because it was easier to embed them in YouTube into an online book than other tools. Let's have a look. This is what we were talking about when I talked about H5P, the HTML5, and it just allows us to bring to life elements with a visual and text connection, along with all the research that is involved in that space. But as I said, in case people had to download it at a site, and then that was the only time they could have it, we always had a walkthrough of what was that experience, what was the interactivity doing, and what were the things, the key learning outcomes, the examples, the narratives that were in there. We even used things that pushed our learners to record themselves, to make little files of them reflecting in the moment and to save them on their laptop. It's very easy to build in. It just uses this H5P. You can talk, you just go record, and it will start recording me right now. And do anything I talk about will be taken in, and then I go done, and I can either retry or download and keep that as a resource. So it doesn't stop in the moment. There is actually a tangible takeaway. The interesting thing that we had to sort of navigate is that while this is an open education resource, can be accessed and used by anyone in the world, and the text itself can be remixed and reused as they wish, there is a caveat in that we used images either from a Getty subscription from a previous project or were designed by our visual designer. So the images are the only things that are not in that remix space. So we have to find a way to, within the limitations of the Pressbook platform, to say, hey, yeah, take all the text, recreate as you like, but please don't steal the images because Getty will chase us. And they will. Okay, let's go back. So, what have we learned so far? Apart from the standard kind of project stuff, particularly in the OER or open agenda space, of that balancing projects' priorities and time and capacity for a project that often sits in your own time and outside of your allocated work hours. That's going to be a standard across open work. I wish it wasn't, but there's no easy way, particularly in a university setting, to have WAM allocated or to have hours allocated for this kind of stuff. The library that I work for is lucky in that we can budget work time for that, and we received a small grant for this project so I could hire a visual designer. But for the academics, it was done for love and passion. And that's a big barrier to overcome for other projects. So the other things that we learned were that projects differ, and what I mean by that is that what we did in 2 previous projects with relatively the same team looked very different for this one because of people's roles changing, because of differences in pre-formatting elements within the Pressbooks versus WordPress where we built another thing. All of that changed things more than we anticipated. We also learned how we had to be very sensitive with curation. That because equity and diverse voices and those different contexts had to be considered in design, there were things sometimes that couldn't be shared, that researchers weren't ready to release, for example, or that weren't applicable to the broader early childhood space and may only be specific to Victoria. So we had to be very careful with what we curated. We learned that even when you have templates, that you really need to guide all of your team in the using of templates. It's a thing. And related to that is, even when you have got your content, what you think is all wrapped up, ticked off, so we can hand it over to the visual designer and then to the builders, sometimes your content developers, your writers, don't understand those deadlines and are changing things after we've already stepped through a lot of those steps. So there was a lot of cycling back to try and fix, they've changed content there, how do we actually design that differently then? We also learned that, user guides would be very helpful for future projects to support learning design and engagement so that people didn't have to relearn the things that we did. So we think that what we should be working on next is a supportive guide for Deakin OER space to how do you do this kind of work together. And we really talked about the potentials of the format, being, whether it's Pressbooks or another open platform for textbooks, it allowed not only the learners to access content, but also people in the projects were able to see their contribution in a really meaningful way. And by that, I mean, we flag visual designers, we flag sound designers. It's that kind of work that designers and developers do is often hidden, and a really important part of this project, and I think for all kind of open access projects, is surfacing those people. So, finally, the work in the earlier course design project and the Department of Education and Training modules really did build this sort of philosophy and pedagogies and frameworks that have then shaped this OER. It drew on the data, the research and feedback from those projects. And then this project will do the same moving forward. And it gave us a way to shape digital experiences consistently when working in this space. That effective design is primarily learner or user-focused and relational. That content development needs to be responsive to and value that user or learner. That contextual design is only possible when you have teams of experts working together. And that open by design will ground our future OER work. And the final takeaway would be that, as I said at the start, people need to be positioned at the heart of any engagement with technology. The pilot OER project has played an important role for us in enabling us to further add value to those earlier projects and to future digital learning projects. And it's made knowledge created that could have sat behind a Deakin paywall or sat within a Department of Education and Training space that will close in 6 months. It's brought it back out. It's not going to disappear. It's going to be trawled by the web archive, and it doesn't disappear. So, thanks for having me to talk about something that's a little bit sidesteppy from the kind of other sessions you've been having. Feel free to get in contact, and if you had any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
So I think we do have quite some time for questions. So,
I see with some of the H5P content you had a transcription below. How do you deal with transcribing the YouTube embeds?
So we have closed captioning. So if you're experiencing them digitally, that's no problem because the closed captioning will come up. But we could have put the accessible text below, but because some of the videos are an hour long, it would have been not great experience. So we had to put them in an accessible appendix. And sometimes for those videos, we didn't put the whole content, the speaker 1, speaker 2, speaker 3. Sometimes it was the core concepts that they shared. So we translated it into what was the key things that they talked about in that particular video.
Thank you, that was awesome. You said that it's not quite published, so this might be a bit premature, but what's the plan to kind of promote and disseminate and get it out there kind of thing, beyond perhaps the usual suspects of the academic world that it will naturally find it? How are you going to disseminate it more broadly?
That's a great question, and there's a couple of things that will be involved. One is my institution has just been through a few years of a restructuring, including the library. The library now has a library events and public programs team, and we also have a communications group. So there is pathways through them that we'll be talking to, but in particular, we know that public libraries have an amazing connection to the local schools and local kindergartens. So my concept is that we partner with them to be able to bring this to them, to do sessions, to do workshops with some of the academics facilitating. And that would be a better way of getting it out there than just, here's an online session about we've just published. So embedded in the community, live.
From what you shared with the Figma files, it looks gorgeous. Do you have what was your favourite part of the project?
For me, the favourite part was when we actually had workshop days in person at a place near my home. Oops, there's my reminder to move. At a place called Warn Ponds. So that's when we could actually come together and talk through, throw things on a board, throw things out, take photos, think about stuff, have lunch, maybe some wine. These things happen. That people-based stuff was probably the most fun. But I can tell you, for my visual designer, it was learning how to use Figma, because they'd used XD and other things in the past, but the opportunity to use this tool and pilot it for this project was really helpful for them to know whether they should be using that moving forward, because they're the visual design lead for our area. And its functionality just does so much of what she needs, and it's very clear that she can take that and give that to the developer and go, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is the wireframe. And the developer can look at it and go, oh, I get it, I get what you're trying to do. And then they can work on that, and they go back and forth. And it's just been a really invaluable tool to visualise and communicate between different languages, because you've got your academics speak, you've got your developers speak, you've got your visuals speak. And any tool that opens it up for discussion and makes it transparent is just so invaluable.
Any questions?
We can start talking about Piaget and Parton if you'd like.
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. So you mentioned about the Getchy images that could not be licensed under Creative Commons. So are there other, licensing challenges that you got?
Some are easy. So for some of the part of the book, we use Unsplash, which is just a joy, isn't it? Oh, God, you've got to love Unsplash. And so for something like that, I go in. It's super easy to deal with in terms of copyright compliance and intellectual property happiness and all those things. And it's not going to be my friend. It's all right. Go that way. Getty, we had purchased the items, the imagery, and some short videos, and we could use them in, pretty much for the rest of time. But while our use was unlimited, the sharing with others was not. We knew that could be a problem with font choice. We have our visual team is very strong, could have designed our own fonts, but then that becomes Deakin intellectual property, and so we just went for stock standard what came with the platform, and the visual designer just tweaked it to make it as readable as possible. The other licensing thing was around the content, because so much of it came from the original Department of Education and Training modules. We had to really go through that contract, really figure out who owns the copyright. And it turns out we own the copyright to the content. The Department of Education and Training, even though they paid us for the project, they have usage rights, but not copyright. And part of what was built into the contract, which was very clever by the project lead at that time, was the reuse of this learning materials in other contexts. So again, that was like, whoosh, that made it a lot easier. The thing that becomes complicated is referencing, like in terms of, because it's so research heavy, in a university, we have provided all of the references, obviously. It's a textbook. The only problem we have, and one we have no way of getting around, is that if someone wants to go further in their reading and go off and look at those particular resources, unless they have institutional access in some way, or it's available through ERIC or another free, a more open database, we can't get them access to that, which is, I'd like to tear down the whole publishing industry, but I don't think Elsevier will let me do that.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. So, any other questions?
I loved at the start you said it was very people-centred and you did some workshops. I wonder, because it's about learning through play, did you have workshops with little people playing?
No, not in the actual design of the project, but in the research that informs the OER, yes. So the academics and the professors, they go into the classroom to do teaching. Like, even though they're teaching at uni, they still go and often do sessions in kindergartens, in early years. They do testing, because a lot of play bases around space, so we're talking, going in and having dirt, mud baths and all these kind of things set up, and there's some beautiful images in here of that sort of thing. So there was play at the heart of it, but it had to be filtered through the research.
So you mentioned Elsevier and all the problems that exist with academic publishing. For your collaborators, was it much of a mind flip to moving to this sort of open model, or was that something that they came to really easily?
So one of the other editors with me, Naomi David, I work very heavily with her, and she is an academic and a writer. For her, it comes very easily. She's very involved with social justice and open access and opening up different voices. So she works in the Nike Institute. For a lot of the other authors and editors, these are people who are prolific researchers and publishers, and it wasn't an easy flip to do. What is the outcome for me, for WAM, for prestige, for...
Is that going to drive the British Index?
Yes. And so it really relied on Naomi and myself to do the bulk of the work and pull together what they'd already done. Because they were happy to have done that work earlier with the debt project because it was funded, it meant that it relieved them from teaching hours. But until OERs and open access and other open education pedagogies are supported by institutions, it's going to be, you're going to need champions who put probably too much of themselves into projects to get them done. That's a bummer of a note I've left you on.
I also have a simple question, like can we access those content now, or we have to wait for the publicity or something like that?
To have a look at the...
Yeah, like the first page to download the book.
So I did we've been testing,
Okay.
and mind you, I've still got to fix up a reference or two.
Yep.
Most boring part of any...
Yeah, because I actually tried to search Google and it's not there yet.
No, so it's not there's a private link that I've been showing you, my editor link.
Okay.
Because I can't press publish until the copyright statement is accurate and clear, and until the publishing platform, which is calls and their use of Pressbooks, until they give it a tick. So I'm technically not allowed to press publish or I'll get in trouble.
Yep.
But it will be in the next couple of weeks.
Yep. Yep. If there's no question, I think.
People get 5 minutes back in their day.
What?
They get a bit extra time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You want to speak more, right?
No, no.
Okay, so if there's no more question, we will. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.